Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the BrickSide Chat Podcast, where we take your questions and turn them into conversations. I'm Paul.
I'm Evan.
And I'm David.
And today we're going to be discussing failure. What is it? How to identify it? And most importantly of all, how to learn from it.
Yeah, and I think just to start, we can say what's a failure is you.
Kind of. As like not a joke, yeah, I think everyone needs to expect to have failure and to fail along the lines. You know, you're not going to be 100% successful all the time.
Definitely.
We put it as a joke on the list, but I think it's very true. You know, like
Yeah.
you cannot be successful 100% of the time, and if you are, then I think you're blindsided to something.
You have to really go into any kind of enterprise with the, what they say, plan for the worst, hope for the best. If you go into it expecting that you're going to succeed, not only are you going to be unprepared for failure, but you're also more likely to be emotionally devastated by failure. But if you kind of go into it with the expectation that something bad is going to happen, yet with everything in place to get around that bad thing, then hopefully you'll be pleasantly surprised.
Yeah, that'd be the hope for sure. And I think just as a starting off point here, we should make the distinction between like major failures, which are not necessarily something you can learn from, but just something where it's the end game, and minor failures, which are really learning opportunities. And I think just to start, like a major failure, obviously, you know, the business cash runs out or whatever, anything where it's game over and operations as is need to be liquidated or ceased.
Yeah, and it's not to say that you can't learn from a major failure, but it more means that you can't have anything that's applicable to the situation because the situation has been ended.
Right. Your
Exactly.
business may be over, but if you decide to start a new one, you now probably have, you know, an idea of how to mitigate that exact problem happening again.
Yeah, and so we're not really going to be discussing too many strategies for how to get back into it if your entire business goes. That's a little bit beyond us. We're more going to be discussing how to deal with kind of the unexpected bumps that are going to come up in even the healthiest business, which we would call like a minor failure or a learning
100%.
opportunity.
And I think just a few examples, starting off, we can dig into a bit more going forward, is just like minor failures, you know, bad purchases or wasted time resource, poor hiring decisions, high debt, or like too much leverage into debt, and grand ideas that don't necessarily pan out and stuff like that.
Definitely, because when you're running a business, everything is a resource. That's why they call it human resources or geopolitical resources, or that's not really a business thing. But, everything is like a quantifiable numeric resource. And so if you spend a lot of time on a project and it flops, you might not have actually spent money, but you have lost money because you could have been doing something more productive. And so that is definitely viewable as a failure. And obviously, if you did spend money on it, then that money might be down the drain, or at least some of it might be. And that's why when you are scoping out potential purchases and stuff, and we'll get into this a little bit more later in terms of how to actually identify potential mistakes, but you always need to be erring on the side of caution and being aware that every dollar you spend might be the last time you see it. Not to scare anyone, but
yeah, and like we made mistakes right at the beginning. You know, first 3-4 months we were blowing through cash like it was nothing, and not just on inventory. Obviously, the inventory is an investment that you assume returns, but we were buying things like accounting scale, which at some point we would have purchased regardless, but like we bought that before we even opened our store.
Chow and Chat Wingstop.
Yeah, I mean, well, of course there's all that stuff that like, you know, we started the YouTube channel and then we like all of a sudden got this little bit of popularity or something. We were like, oh, let's just like try to expand this, and like things didn't work there. We did After Hours in late 2022, and like that was a complete flop, and you know, that was time that like it was fun and everything, and we, you know, still hang out with those friends and all, but it doesn't make sense to like spend the time to set everything up and then to edit it and then to release it, and the fans don't like it.
To wrangle everyone.
Yeah, so like things like that are small failures that we can like learn from and kind of understand, at least in our YouTube direction, of like this is a direction we shouldn't go with stuff. And then like, you know, even the counting scale, I think at that time we had spent all that money on it and we were like, okay, wait, we need to like, we did after a few months realize too much money was going down the drain. We need to spend it on stuff that really matters now, and then slowly over time we can get those nicer things.
That said, you should always be afraid to spend money, but you shouldn't be unreasonably afraid to spend money, because there are things like, for example, our tape dispenser. which humble brag here, we bought $1,000 tape dispenser.
It goes up every time.
Originally thought to be $600.
Yeah, $940 pitched to me as $600.
I did think it was $600.
Yeah, $947 tape dispenser.
I can say as an independent outsider, it's probably worth.
Yeah,
looking
back on it, it's totally worth. But like, if I had been given informed consent there, I would have said no, and I would not have wanted to do that. But Evan was convinced, and it was worth it.
I think it was 904.
Sure.
So we saved $43 there.
Nice.
Sure. Well, no, we didn't. It's not a deal.
I know.
Point being, there are purchases where you should be, a little uneasy about spending high amounts of money. But if rationally you understand, we're saving minutes here, we're saving hours over a week here, in the long haul, it's probably worth it. Especially if it's something like, for me, I'm always just looking for the least friction possible is sort of one of our guiding principles, is like your day-to-day tasks in terms of like the employees or yourself should be so easy that you don't even have to think about it, because that is sort of an intangible there when you're purchasing goods for like the tape dispenser or whatever, is just that little bit of, I guess, ease of performance that over the long haul reduces the like general stress and probably increases performance, if that makes sense. Like if there's a process that's really annoying for everyone to do that can be fixed with a $300-$400 purchase, I'd say generally go for it, just because the overall attitude of the business is going to be better in the long run.
Yeah, and theoretically that hopefully, within your team at least leads to less chance of failure within them and stuff.
We're really jumping all around here, but I just want to add on to that a good sign that something maybe is worth it is if you keep returning to it over and over again and then dismissing it. Like if every couple weeks you're like, man, I really wish I had bought this, and then you go look at it and you're like, man, I really shouldn't buy this, and then that goes on for months and months and months, that probably is a sign that you actually do need it.
Yeah. However, there is the opposite too, I think, where you start to pour money into something and, probably not a physical good or something, but maybe more of a project you're working on or a new product or something. And you get to a point where you're like, well, I've already spent $5,000 on it. It's not like doing amazing, but what is another $1,000 like for another month or something? Yeah.
And that gets into the sunk cost fallacy, where it's like, in your mind, you're justifying it because you've spent money. But in reality, if you've spent that money, you're not guaranteed to get it back just because you spend even more money. Right. So you do need to step back away from it in terms of like the personal investment of a project or whatever it may be. Like, yeah, I've spent $3,000 on this already, and I'm going to need at least $3,000 to whatever. I mean, these are just made up numbers. $3,000 to $5,000 more to make it come to fruition. Do I know that I'm going to get all of that back in a reasonable enough time that it makes sense to double down?
Totally. But you also don't want to fall into the sunk cost fallacy trap. Yeah. Because the sunk cost fallacy gets bandied around so much nowadays
100%.
that I feel like a lot of people probably cancel stuff prematurely, when in reality they should keep spending money on it. Because if your data is suggesting that this really is a good idea, just because you've spent an ungodly amount of money on it does not mean that you should cancel it. If your evidence is suggesting that this really is a good idea, and this would be a sunk cost fallacy but might still be worth it, if you've spent $10,000 on something and it's going to cost $200 more to finish it, is your business really going to live or fail by $200? $200. $200. Like, that is, a tiny percent of everything that you've spent. Unless you're like sure that it's not going to work, is just the finding out, like, okay, maybe it is a remote chance that it would work. Is $200 really like that much of a loss? So that is something to be aware of before you just cancel something, because once you've canceled something, it can be kind of hard to restart it again if you realize you messed up.
Yeah. For me, I think something that you were saying that I like, a personal example I can think of where you're like, oh, is this thing actually profitable in the long run, even though like this quarter we lost or whatever, just because it was people being retrained or whatever. Like for us, with the whole unexpected tax bill thing, there was a time where I was like, I might have to cut everyone's hours and I'm just going to be the only one working. But then I realized that's like just gonna end up being a bigger waste of square footage and all this time. Like even just small things, like if you think of like, oh, we're paying to keep the lights on, but there's only one person here. But I know in the back of my mind, it's still worth it to pay everybody to upload parts, even though we have this setback. I should probably sink more money into the uploading of parts because long term, we have seen that it works.
Yeah, and that's almost like the thought of pivoting, you know, in that moment of like, okay, I need to do something because this one thing didn't work. Where if you have a small failure, obviously, usually there's a fix that needs to come alongside that, but you don't always need to pivot in the wrong direction. And we've done this a few times too. You know, where when we started doing used in 2021, we didn't actually have a good grasp of what that even meant, but we had seen other people doing it, and we thought, okay, we need to go hire contractors and do things like that. When you and I think, initially
should have done it just ourselves for a little bit.
And the reason we wanted to get into used and have others do it is you and I still wanted to do new. So our thought was we weren't going to pivot from doing new to used, but instead
They'd be parallel.
The thought was they'd be parallel. We'd have used people on the outside doing that, and then it comes in and we add it. But we then actually ended up going all the way to used because I think we kind of screwed up in the beginning, not having a good understanding, and then we had to get super involved in it. You know, and maybe that's not a bad thing that we only do used now. But I think that was for sure a direction that we didn't expect to go. And I kind of attribute the new falling out of our inventory or out of our process due to that misunderstanding of what it really took to do used at the beginning of that process.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with that. You don't want to also panic pivot where you're like, oh, this thing isn't working, so I need to jump onto something else, anything else, right? You want to, if you're only losing a little tiny bit of money with an inefficient process, then I would rather lose a little tiny bit of money than a whole bunch of money from randomly selecting a different direction, right? Instead, I would rather think carefully, continue losing a little bit of money for a little bit of time, and think carefully about, okay, which direction am I going to jump after?
Yeah, and for DNA Brix, there's been a few of these where it's like a diversion, I guess, where you're trying to ignore the problem and just like find a quick fix. And there's like the old saying for like, just in general, like you buy it right or you buy it twice. And like, I think in this case, buying it right is, re-upping or, I guess, refining the current processes that are good so that they're better, instead of jumping off of the good practices to something that could be good but you really have no idea. Like for us, there was a time where we tried the DNA Depot wholesaling parts to other stores, and then there's the time where I'm just like fielding offers for the whole store just to see, which aren't like necessarily bad ideas on paper, but when I like sat back for a while and just like looked at our most profitable departments and processes, I was like, oh, well, or I could, take on a little debt or move some money around and get more parts for sale like we've been doing, just in a bit faster way, and we'll be fine. So I think pivoting is necessary after failure if the failure was, failure in the whole theory of the thing and not just a slip up of a month or a quarter or something like that.
Yeah, you don't want to confuse a failure and a setback because sometimes things just happen and they move you backwards in time, which is a loss, don't get me wrong, but it's not a failure, right? Failure means the process isn't working. Not just not working optimally.
And something to remember too is like everyone in a business is a human, until we get the AI robot. Everyone in a business is a human. Like people get sick, people take vacation, or someone can't come in today, someone has to cover. So those things that lead to like a couple $100 loss or a couple $1,000 loss over a long term aren't actually failures, like you were saying. You need to recognize the setbacks, and then when it is a failure, you need to evaluate the pivots.
Yeah, it's kind of like a square is a rectangle, but a rectangle is not a square. Where a setback, might be a failure.
Sorry.
But a failure is not always a setback.
Yeah.
It might actually push you in the right direction.
Yeah. Like a setback, I would say, is like the easiest to recover from, because sometimes you don't even need to change anything. Like if an employee calls out sick, they break their leg or whatever, and they can't come in and pick for a week.
Jeez.
Only a week.
That's
Only a week.
great.
Only a week.
I've been drinking a lot of milk.
Yeah. Got milk. But if something like that happens, there's nothing you can do about that, and hopefully your business is not reliant on a single employee. Then call back. You just accept that, move on, and wait for them to come back. And there's nothing you do about that setback. It just slows you down. Another thing that a lot of people, I feel, and this is very present in our industry with the enigma of the BrickLink marketplace and how prices fluctuate, that no one, maybe BrickLink understands, but I don't think anyone has a super great grasp on exactly what determines the month-to-month gross market of BrickLink, which for those of you who aren't familiar with our YouTube channel, we sell Lego on a website called BrickLink, is unexpected successes with seemingly no reason. Sometimes for an inexplicable reason, the whole website, every seller is just up. And it's not like it's a seasonal thing. I mean, there is a seasonal difference, but just randomly out of the blue with no previous data, there's just a whole bunch of sales that happen in a random month.
And you should be pretty, I guess, cautious to count those as wins. Like, yeah, it's good that you're making more sales, but you need to recognize when your successes are due to internal business factors of improvement versus just market is up, or we happen to get a really nice purchase this month, but it's not something we could expect for another 2 years.
Yeah.
Yeah, you don't want to go from like 1 month of being incredible because 25% of your sales came from one piece, and then next month now you're discouraged because all of a sudden your sales aren't the same dollar amount. It's like, well, of course they're not going to be the same dollar amount because that one thing was a complete outlier. You can't count on that.
And you also don't want to get tricked into the trap of where things seem to be going really well for even a long period of time, and you have no idea why. Yeah. You should be trying to get to the bottom of your successes just as much as you should be trying to get to the bottom of your failures, because there's always that kind of panic moment where you're like, oh, I'm not actually being successful. I'm just looking at it in a certain way, but I have this debt piling up, or I'm taking a loss in the longest run, but for these couple months, my revenue seems to be up or whatever. And so it's really important to be skeptical of.
And I think that's one of the big points we have down here is just when you are successful, being not completely aware, but at least having an idea of where that success is coming from and what led to it over a long term. Because when those failures do come up, you want something to reference as a sort of compare contrast to, okay, what changed, in what moment did we begin to transition, and what decisions led to this?
And we've done that a lot, where like we have a few months of something that was going really well, and then it slows down, and usually that's the point at which we're like, okay, why were we doing well? And usually it's a little late at that point because you don't really remember what you were doing 3 months ago. Like, the concept of the basic, but you need to really in the moment take a good understanding and a good look at what you're doing to really
this is why, and not completely related, but just in general business advice, I guess, collecting data, even if it's like really simple, like how many, for example, for our industry, how many parts did we list today? How many parts did we end the day at total? Just collecting small things like that you can get daily or weekly over a long period of time will really help when you do hit these setbacks.
Yeah. Something that I've always repeated is if you don't record it, you can never record it again. Like, if you don't take the time to record this data now, that data is just permanently gone. It will never come back. So. And
there's the old proverb: the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is now. So even if you haven't been, you should look into plotting those things down.
Yeah, and that's something we'll talk about in next episode, is kind of keeping track of things like specific data points and stuff, and they're what points are you collecting too much and everything. So we'll get into that next time. But I think something, if you guys are like good now to move into the kind of the learning from failure and what you can grab from that and 100%. Everything. I don't know if Paul, if you want to kind of start off and dig into this one a little bit.
Sure. Let's just assume you have failed at this point and you have identified that something is wrong Maybe it's obvious at the surface level what's wrong. Like you have a huge backlog of unfulfilled orders, right? And you're like, oh gosh, customers are going to be angry because if it doesn't ship in 3 days, it's free. And you are going to lose all of that money, right? We don't have that policy, so please don't email us about that. But we're just going to pretend that, right? And you are getting very dangerously close to that. You now need to implement some kind of a recovery plan in order to get things back on track. Or let's just say that you're past that and you just lost $2,000 worth of sales because you went past that 3 day. And so now you had to go ahead and refund everyone. That would be very, very scary. And the first step, at least in my mind, on learning how to respond to that failure is going to be analyzing yourself and your own emotional state, because you are your greatest enemy. And as the business owner, you are the business's greatest enemy as well, because you are hopefully the only employee at this company who can single-handedly destroy it. I mean, theoretically, any employee, if they really, really, really wanted to, could. But
burn the warehouse down.
Yeah, but just in general, you are the biggest threat to your business by making poor decisions. So before you start making decisions, it's really important to know yourself, take a deep breath, analyze your own inner emotional state and be like, right now, am I in the mind space where I'm going to be able to look at this rationally? Have I not slept in 48 hours and have no concept of what I was just saying 2 minutes ago? In that case, then you need to ask, okay, is this truly immediately urgent? Or is it going to be better for the business if I go sleep for 8 hours, come back tomorrow and deal with it, right? Know your inner emotional state. Am I really, really angry at this employee and I'm going to let them go, even though deep down I know it's not really their fault?
Yeah.
Right.
That's a big thing too. And it's dangerous too, because there's moments where it feels so necessary to make a decision, but in the deepest rational corner of your mind, you can think, okay, I actually don't need to do anything right now. But then there's the inverse where it's like, we're crashing and burning, something needs to happen right now. And again, I think that falls under the major failure. So we can maybe go ahead with the assumption that it is the minor failure, sleep on it or talk to people who are.
And something if it is a major failure and you're like really bleeding or something, there is the potential, maybe, depending what the problem is, to put a Band-Aid on it of some sort. And this is something Paul and I do very often. It's like, we need to find a long-term solution to this issue. But for now, we know that this small little thing will fix it for the next week or whatever. Yeah. So we can throw that on, make that small change, and then we'll discuss a proper solution for this issue. And that's something you don't just want to keep bleeding out while you're trying to figure out a good thing or make an irrational decision on want to go something crazy. You put a Band-Aid on it.
Yeah, a good real world example of that would be, you're really angry at this employee. It's unlikely to permanently damage your relationship with that employee if you send them home early or put them on paid probation for 2 days or whatever, because then you can go ahead and step back and really think instead of firing them on the spot and telling them get out. You can always tell them to come back, especially if you're paying them. And or just something where it's like a Band-Aid might be where that policy of 3 days, you have to refund these people, but remove that policy for the time being. It might be something that generates you sales because people have confidence in your urgency. But just for the next month, until we get to the bottom of what caused this, you're going to remove your, 3 days are free policy.
Yeah, 100%. And going forward with the, recovery plan is if it's not something where it's needs a Band-Aid right now or whatever, I think a good first step is collecting the data, which we referenced earlier, and hopefully you have it. And if not, doing your best to retroactively do that. And then talk to those involved, talk to the employees, talk to peers in the industry if you have that resource, and figure out if this is an independent thing to your business or if it's something everybody's experiencing. Because if it's the latter, it's not like you can do nothing, but there is less you can do. And there's also, less responsibility on yourself to feel like a personal failure, I guess.
Yeah, if the industry as a collective is down, then you feel less bad.
Yeah.
Yeah. Another really important thing to mention about interviewing employees is if you have 10 employees working and they're like spread across different departments, you're going to get a bunch of different answers as to why the failure happened.
Mm-hmm.
And each employee might have their own individual idea, but then you interviewing all of them are maybe going to get a better picture of everything that's going on at a much deeper level. And that's why it's really important for you as a business owner to be involved with your employees and not just sit back in your office and do nothing, because they are the boots on the ground and are going to have the direct eye experience.
Yeah. There's the classic example of the group knows more than the whole, and emergence theory, all that. Like, if you ask 10 people the same question, none of the individuals will be right, but the average of all the answers will be the closest to correct. So it's very important to, like Paul was saying, talk to everybody from every point of view, and then sort of do your best to aggregate that data and put it into one formulated, I guess, failure point.
Yeah, and hopefully that does determine what that probable failure for that reason was.
Or at least give you a clue as to where you need to go.
Yeah, going forward with that, once you've, I guess, identified the failure, you sort of, next step is to determine how much of a failure it was. Like, can you put it in terms of dollars or man hours or whatever? Yeah.
Is it really worth fixing? I mean, obviously you ideally want to stop every loss of money, but let's just assume your net profit is acceptable. It's just this specific process is losing you money. Is the continued loss worth the man hours to fix it? Because if it's something that requires tens of thousands of dollars reworking every asset of your business to save $5 a month, why are you wasting time on this? Just move on. And that is definitely, especially for me, sometimes I get lost in this organizational mindset where I'm like, this room needs to be, there needs to be a system. And the truth is there should be a system for things, but sometimes developing the system is not cost efficient.
Yeah, it's like you'll see the returned gains from developing that system when you're 94.
Exactly.
Or whatever it may be. So there's failures and there's setbacks or whatever, minor inconveniences where you're losing, like you say, $5, $10 a month. It's not always worth it to create an action plan, because even just drafting the action plan, you've already lost even more.
But let's say that it is more than $5 or $10 a month, and you now have collected all of your data and you've kind of figured out what you think was the core issue. Your next step is going to be backtracking to try to figure out the last moment in time at which case you are not fated to be on this course. Because there was a moment, and it might be before you started the business, where you were not destined to end in this failure, right? There was a single decision that was the straw that broke the camel's back, right? Because it might, the problem might be very complex and there's all of these factors, but there still was a moment where it was like, sure, let's do it, or whatever. Or it was, oh, okay, we're going to expand, and via expanding, we hired all these people and this one dude was bad.
I would probably disagree with you.
You would?
Yeah. I would actually think that for most things within a business, a failure is not like one problem, one thing that causes a whole thing. I'd say it's a chain of like all these little things that usually add up.
But at what point was the chain no longer avertible? Like, because, as you're building that chain of events, there's a certain tipping point at which you now can no longer exit that chain, right? Yeah. Because if you hire a bunch of people, you can still let them go. But once you've made payroll and now you're in debt, right? Now you're in debt. I
think there, in theory, is that straw that broke the camel's back, but it can be very hard to determine. So maybe a like middle ground strategy is looking at, here are the 3 most likely contributing factors.
Yeah.
Or here are the top 5.
Or here was the line of reasoning that brought me
exactly.
Here, it just because the main result I'm hoping to get out of identifying this inciting incidents or incidents is for you to be able to kind of write down what your mindset was and what the factors were, so that next time you encounter a similar situation, you don't make the same mistake again.
Exactly.
And you also then might be able to reverse engineer and salvage assets that are still in existence from this situation by tracking down where those assets evolved over the course of the failure, right? Because there might be certain elements of this process that actually did work out really well. And by going back to the cause, you can kind of figure out how those assets succeeded and how the ones that failed.
I think that's also something extremely important when you're looking at like even your business as a whole. A lot of us get caught in like seeing what's not working.
Mm-hmm.
You need to also keep an eye out for like what is working, and not just so you understand what is working, but just so you like mentally are like okay with like, you know what, 75% of what we're doing is good.
Mm-hmm.
You don't want that 25% of what's not working to just cloud your judgment, make you think like you as a human are a failure and everything, and your business is going downhill.
The internal negative thoughts can usually be a pretty loud minority.
Exactly.
And it's important to like, if you're still at a point where you're able to even think about what could be going wrong, you haven't failed so much that it's not even worth thinking about.
Exactly. There's also the diamond in the rough, where even within a process that's 99% failure, if you look at it, you might be able to salvage something out of it that you can apply to a different process and maybe even make your money back from that loss,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because it might be that your whole product failed, but in developing that product, you came up with a really good supply chain that you can now apply to something else, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
it's like Evan's new 3-door cabinet failed, but he was able to leverage this certain lumber contract or whatever it may be.
Right. These hinges now I can use for another.
Yeah, exactly.
And there are lots of companies out there who did start from a failure. You know, I should have thought of this before and done some Googling so I could list them, but I remember hearing there's lots of stories where a company invents something, that thing totally fails, but in the process of inventing it, they invented something else, and then they go on to, you know, just sell that one thing, and then they're super successful.
And what a lot of products are is like a gap in the market, which people could say is a failure. You know, if there's 10 companies in a market and they're all selling something similar, but there's something else people want, you know, that could be their failure as to not finding what people want. And then that 11th company comes up and just sweeps the market because they found that little niche of what everyone was wanting.
100%. Yeah. And with all of this, I think my guiding principle is always remain cautiously or rationally optimistic. So like there's no reason to ever believe that everything is against you, because that's just like a pretty easy self-fulfilling prophecy. Like, oh well, we'll never be good enough, we're losing money already, let's just give up. It's better to think, like, I know it sounds cliche and like very pseudo inspirational, but like really each failure truly is a learning experience, and you should not necessarily be happy, but try to look at it more as a game or as a new challenge to address. Like, I've got an opportunity here to make things better in the long haul and keep us plugging away.
Yeah. I do want to mention one more thing about this whole concept is you should be writing everything down. I just wanted to throw that in before we move on here, but all of this does you nothing if it's not recorded somewhere, because you're going to forget it and then you're just going to fail again. And I think I don't have any research to back this up here, but I think one of the leading causes that a lot of new startups, especially maybe among younger people, fail is that they don't have any records. And we talked about this in our, I can't remember if we did a meetings episode or if we just talked about meetings in an episode, but you are going to forget a lot of what happens in any situation. Your memory is really bad, even if you think it's really good. Like, it might be really good against other people, but against pen and paper, it's nothing. So write everything down.
Take minutes, etc.
But as you're failing through all of this, as you are going through all of this failure here, maybe I need a second cup of coffee.
As your business is using failure to grow.
Yes, you are going to be experiencing a lot of emotions, and there's this kind of archetype of that cool, calculated business owner, and
never met one.
I've never met anyone, and even people who act like that on the exterior, if you really like go to a bar with them, and get them talking, you're going to understand that that's a facade, right? Being a business owner is an incredibly emotional experience. And that's not a bad thing. You should not be trying to eliminate your emotion. You should be using your anger.
And I think maybe just to cut you off real quick, that cannot, it can honestly be damaging to the company as a whole, the whole facade. Because if like you're coming into work every day, and let's say you have 10 employees or 5 employees, and they see you every day, they think everything's business as usual, and then you're going home or you're talking to the people in your actual inner circles, you're like, man, everything's terrible. It's like, that's not good, because the employees should be, you should be being transparent with the actual risks that are coming up and things like that.
There is a balance of how transparent to be, I'd say, though.
You don't need to
You don't want to tell them, like, well, Monday, we'll see if you get paid.
Yeah.
Like, there is a balance, but you do want them to be on the same page, so they also feel like their successes help to grow the business as well. If you're totally just that upfront, everything's going great or, like, fine all the time, they don't also feel that success when that
I do want to call back, though, that you should not be telling your employees that they are the single supporting thing in the entire business, because they as a collective are, but they as an individual are not.
Exactly.
And you don't want to put that on anyone who does not have a sizable share in the company's shoulders, because they're not getting that profit. So it's kind of, at least in my opinion, a little unethical to be telling an employee, if you personally screw up, the business is over.
Yeah. It's like, who is that helping?
It's not helping anyone. Now, that's not saying that you should not bring up failures of the employee with the employee. If someone's failing at their job specifically, then maybe it is time. If they're the problem, or if something they are doing is the problem, I don't want to say they are the problem, but if something they are doing is the problem, then you should maybe not vent your frustration, but establish that things need to improve. However, as you're experiencing all of these emotions, you have to understand that is a very powerful thing, because chances are you got into business being motivated or being passionate about something. And that was hopefully the deciding factor that really helped push you into doing this thing and is fulfilling you every day. So by being aware of your inner emotional state and your fears and anxieties, that is something that is incredibly leverageable. Now, I'm not saying, you should use your anger as your single source of fuel and go all Sith and emo or whatever. But you can use how upset you are at failure as motivation to succeed more, right? And that is a really important thing. And something I do really want to talk about is fear, because I think every business owner at their heart is a very scared person.
Yeah, definitely.
Because the more assets you have, the more you fear them turning into liabilities.
Yeah, now you need to figure out, though, what you're actually afraid of.
Totally.
It can't just be like you're scared. Like, are you scared of losing everything because financially it's going to really hurt you? Or are you scared of losing everything because, in your social circle it's going to be a struggle? Or you want to appear to be that successful person and you don't want to look like a failure to your friends or family or whatever that might be.
And also, is this fear being caused by you? Like, is this something that you're truly scared of, or is it something that people are telling you should be scared of? Yeah. Because something that, actually, I can't really say we experience a lot, at least from people that we care about, is naysayers. Although we do, like, on YouTube or whatever, see tons of people occasionally who are like, oh, you're doing it wrong or whatever. But that's pretty ignorable. But there are always going to be people around you who just don't really believe. And so you need to ask yourself, am I scared because someone put some doubt in my mind?
Yeah.
See, I love using that as a motivation.
Oh, totally.
Like, that is totally my motivation for, like, you don't believe in this, I'm going to prove you wrong.
Yeah, I'm not saying to get rid of it. What I'm saying is there's a moment of difference between you being scared about something and then someone telling you to be scared and then you using that as a motivation.
Yeah. There's the extrinsic motivation of I'm gonna prove the haters wrong and everything, but then there's also the anxious brain wants to be like, well, maybe they're right. But at the end of the day, like 95% of the naysayers, so-called, are gonna be completely uninformed about the industry or the business model, and they're just probably projecting some deep down anxiety about their own life path. But point being, you need to parse through what you're afraid of, but also why you are afraid of it, and what the actual origin of that negative emotion is.
Yeah.
There's like and this is a point you brought up to me earlier, Paul, is you also should be thinking about, like, is my headspace negative and am I stressed right now because of something completely unrelated to the business? Like, on pen and paper, is the business actually profitable month over month? And I just happen to have like a really rough few months outside of that.
And I would like to kind of share personally, as I was getting really close, I was really worried that I was not going to hit my graduation date for college. I wasn't going to get everything done. And I definitely was way more stressed about the business because my fear of, am I going to hit all of these deadlines was turning into, am I going to hit all of these deadlines, right, in the business? And it's really easy especially if what you do in life is one thing and business, which I feel like a lot of startups and entrepreneurs, at least for a couple years of their life, it's basically the one thing in life I can't give up and work. And not that that's necessarily healthy or not, but you want to make sure not to cross those emotions because it's just kind of asking for disaster.
Yeah, I think it's usually the one thing in life you can't give up is work, and then the business is that second thing. And when stress comes in from an outside source and it makes your business feel it, that's definitely hard. And it's really difficult to just like differentiate that.
Totally.
Because stress is not something that usually a human can like pinpoint to one thing. It's like all these factors that just end up happening, and then over time you snap or whatever, and you don't know why.
And sometimes it's as far as you don't even realize you're stressed until like months looking back, and you're like, that's why I didn't that's why I made that snap decision, or I haven't made a home cooked meal in 3 months. Like,
maybe
time
this
is just flying under me.
Something that we'll do an episode on in the future, but like your mental health as a business owner is an asset to your business. Like, you should not be destroying yourself for the business because the business is going to suffer because of that.
Actually, long term, you're probably destroying yourself and the business.
You should be taking time out of your day. So, I mean, maybe not meditate if that's not your thing, but like sit down and do some introspection as to like, how am I feeling? Why am I feeling this? Is it related to the business, right? You should like at least spend like just 10 minutes because that 10 minutes is going to yield a lot to your business.
100%. I think another thing to point out in terms of failure is like going forward from failure, are you now too afraid or too reserved in your risk taking? Because there are things to actually be afraid of, but are you just afraid because it's the unknown or this is a novel experience? Even though, again, on pen and paper or rationally, you could say, it'd be profitable, but one time we tried something that looked profitable and we lost or whatever.
There's also very much like what you just said is like right after a failure, I feel like you might be more likely to swing in either direction where it's like, I'm just going to throw all the money at everything. Or it might be where you become super conservative and super scared of everything.
Yeah. I think a lot of that's the emotion that comes with the feeling of like something didn't work.
Yeah.
Is you're in that like that mindset of you're really not being rational because your mind found something didn't work and you only see these two directions you can go in order to fix it or mitigate it or whatever. And there's not this like middle ground, which you can make a small change, which will help. Because that just doesn't feel drastic enough to get out of this feeling of like stress of something didn't work.
It's probably some deep evolutionary trait.
I'm sure it is. Yeah.
It's like, we didn't kill the deer today. We got to do something.
Right.
I got to eat.
Or I tried to kill the lion and it's not dead, so it's going to come attack me. Like I have to run. It's not like I can hide in this tree. And
etc. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I think something super important when it comes to we're talking about the emotion and stuff, and you just talked about kind of taking that time to maybe sit down and like. Figure out why am I feeling or how am I feeling, why am I feeling this and stuff, is just that'll help you kind of understand and kind of begin to know yourself. And when you're going through this, think, are you generally like an anxious person? Are you always nervous about stuff? Are you, do you get angry easily? Are you mad about stuff? And if you are, then like you should play that into not only how you're feeling in the moment, but like into each decision that's being made for your business. And, am I anxious and that's why I don't want to like hire one more person because it's going to make the money a little bit more thin, even though the business will really succeed if you do.
What I might suggest is like writing out a list of like all of like the common emotions. And then like, if you say, okay, on a normal day, I would rate myself at this out of 10 of everything, and then subtract that many points from your decision. So like if 10 is a panic attack and you're like always at a 6 or a 7, then subtract that from your score, because that's kind of just like a resting anxiety that's not, I mean, I don't want to call you irrational, but like in terms of the business, it might not be related. So, you know, just be aware of what your standard emotion is and keep that in mind when making decisions.
I think this is all tied to just like, at least for us, and I'm sure people listening to, is being also young and in a position of, I guess, supposed power within the business is really like, it's a tough balance, because there's all these external things like, oh, you've got to, you know, become an adult. You need to like make ends meet. And at the same time, you're just, what was originally, I think for most, like something you're just having fun with, now it's like all the societal pressure is just on you to just produce, and you don't know if this is like something you're afraid of or that people are putting on you. And at the same time too, like with me at least, I'm a very optimistic person, and I think it has before, like as much as it pains me to say, it has like caused me to make decisions that probably weren't rational in terms of the business, but it was just something that at the time I was like, well, we've done well before, so let's just go for it, which is like, you know, it's a way to operate. I wouldn't say it's the best way, but I've learned a lot from that, and definitely failed a lot from that as well. But I've tried to take a step back in terms of the optimism meter, I guess. Like in my personal life, yeah, totally happy-go-lucky. But there's a point where it's like we can't just blindly believe we're gonna succeed.
Yeah, and that's something we talked about last episode too, was you have you're a single owner, Paul and I are partnership.
Yeah.
We struggle sometimes from, planning,
paralysis analysis.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Not realizing, okay, we need to stop doing this planning, which is not helping us anymore. We've already passed the point of where we need to know.
The 30-hour mark.
Right. Or whatever it is. Yeah. We need to just execute what we've been planning for a stupid amount of time. And we've fixed a lot of that, but we've definitely been in that trap too of
totally
something doesn't work. We throw a BandAid on it and we try to figure out why it wasn't working, and then we fix it and fix it and fix it and fix it and fix it forever. And eventually we're like, okay, actually for a while, I don't even know at what point we determine like we'll execute now, but like it takes us a very long time, which is not always the best thing, just because
it's a tough middle ground between like, I guess I'll call it launching something from planning and knowing when to launch because you're confident enough in the processes you've laid out, versus doing something very bare bones and it's super volatile to begin with, but it's happening, like production is happening or parts are being sorted or whatever, even if it's not, S tier, perfect refinement. It's there's the balance of you've got this weird shaky process, or you're just talking about doing something.
Yeah. It's kind of, hopefully this reference somebody will get, but we're not all like Littlefinger from Game of Thrones, where we can spend 20 years planning this exact perfect game to manipulate the entire country into like every little step goes perfectly. You should only plan like to the degree that you can actually reasonably guarantee is going to happen. Because if you make a 10-year plan, like maybe year one will go according to plan, like maybe right?
Try month one.
Yeah. So, the best plan is perfect until it doesn't work. So you can definitely get trapped in analysis paralysis, where you are spending so long trying to figure out every little minute detail, when the instant that you actually hit the floor running, once you involve someone who's not you, it just doesn't work.
Yeah. And going off of that, I think we could talk about some good ideas for actually assessing risk, and like, are these things actually a risk, or again, is it just my anxiety? Like, and I think some good things that have helped me is, asking mentor figures who are within the industry and just like generally like elder people to you who are, have life experience, not necessarily in what you do, but just in decision making.
Yeah.
Because it's a huge thing. And it goes back to what I was saying about just being a young person. Like, we don't have, at least for me, I don't have many prior experiences to reference when I'm deciding to rent a space or deciding to sign a, tens of thousands of dollars like inventory purchase.
Yeah. That is definitely a big threat as a younger person. And I think the younger you are, the more of a threat it is, where we kind of have this idea of, I don't need to listen to people, right? And hopefully you kind of grow out of that. But
Yeah.
I think one of the best things that you can do as a business owner is hear people, listen to them, process the information, and then make a decision as to whether to disregard it or not.
Yeah.
You don't need to disregard it before you hear it.
Yeah. Seek first to understand before making yourself understood. Is like, where are these people coming from? Is it because we were talking about naysayers earlier, but there's also the people in your life, like parents or like, other older relatives who are coming from a place of love. And maybe it's not like the most thought out anxiety they're talking to you about, but there's people who are going to say, oh, this isn't going to work because they want it to not work. And then there's people who are saying it because they want it to work and they want you to reevaluate or
and
whatever.
they're concerned.
Yeah. There's also the fact that sometimes you can listen to what someone says and ignore what they mean. Because there's been lots of times where people have given me advice and their motivation was kind of off, but literally what they said actually was extremely intelligent. And so you need to kind of have two stages of listening to people where you try to understand what they meant. I forget what law it is, but there's like a law of communication where it's
always assume positive intent in ambiguous situations.
Yep. And you
Very
should,
nice.
yeah.
That was like, I quoted that
yeah, that was good.
30 times last year. Classic.
And then after you've done that, look at just literally word for word what they're saying and be like, okay, ignoring who told me this, is this a good idea?
Yeah, it's almost like a Punnett square, if you will, of like there's good advice, bad advice, and then good intent, bad intent, and figuring out where it lands over that like 2x2 grid is like probably gonna do you worlds of good in terms of the actual risk assessment.
Yeah, and the other thing is, don't be scared to ask your competitors for stuff. I mean, this might depend. The larger you become in a business, like if you're the CEO of Google, why are you watching this podcast? Also, please hit me up.
Yeah.
But then it might be a little bit different. But if you are in a pretty niche industry, like, don't be afraid to go ask your competitors for advice. I mean, don't give up your trade secrets. But like, David here is technically our competitor, and like he flew out here, and we talk a lot. And Chris James and just other people. We have a whole Discord where we talk to a lot of our competitors and have good relationships with them. And I'm not going to tell them every little thing about our business, but if I'm feeling like, hey, the market's just not right, do you guys also feel that? There's no reason. Your competitors are going to be the most informed people about your industry.
Yeah. 100%.
And they're also human beings, hopefully. So don't be afraid
ChatGPT listing Lego.
Yeah. So don't be afraid to talk to industry figures as well.
And then I guess probably the next step after you've talked to mentors or industry peers is putting all the risks either on pen and paper or on some sort of spreadsheet where you can, to the best of your ability, project these things over a month. Like, if I make this decision now, what's the pros, what's the cons, and then what's my expected value somewhere in between.
Yeah, and this is usually a challenge to kind of forward project.
It's like a huge understatement. It's like the hardest in the world.
Correct.
Yeah.
It's incredibly difficult. But if you collect data over periods of time and stuff and you have that to reference in the past, it's usually a little bit easier to kind of understand theoretically how the future can look for you.
Yeah. And for me, projection is great, but it's almost the second reason why I write everything down. They say that one of the best ways to learn something is just to write it down over and over again until it makes sense. Because if you lay it, you might have all these jumbled thoughts in your head, but then you just lay them all out on a spreadsheet, add some color, some nice formatting, and as you're processing the data, it's not actually writing it down and doing the math. It's just you're fixating on each individual component rather than the whole, and you're building a map in your mind as you write it down. And that might help show you what points of data you're missing because you can't finish this equation. Yeah. And that might tell you, oh, there's a big issue here.
Yeah. Like each graph has an unknown variable, and if you can not necessarily graph it, but something with a spreadsheet, something written down where you can adjust inputs and get semi-accurate expected values. Hopefully again you have the historical data to reference. That's a super powerful tool and probably the closest you can get to an actual like confirmed future. But nothing is guaranteed, and like all of a sudden, the garage burns down. Like, that's not something you can plan on. And I think that goes into what you were saying about the whole black swan.
Yeah. I guess I'll first tell the little stories. There were these scientists. A lot of people believe that there were only ever white swans. And then one day, and so the slang black swan was used to say something that would never happen. And then one day they found an island which only had black swans on it. Mm-hmm. And you need to be thinking, like, is this a black swan? Is this something that I never, ever could possibly predict? Because if you're looking at your worst case outcomes, the garage burning down or whatever, sure, you can have a fire extinguisher, but, like, am I going to pour $100,000 into putting
full fire insurance or whatever
sprinklers in every single drawer, right? Like, there's a point at which you just go, like, okay, sure, this would be catastrophic, but the risk of it actually happening is minute, so I'm just going to ignore it.
You should have insurance for things like that.
Yes,
like, even though the risk is little. There's
also the difference between the internal failure and then the industry failure. Like, BrickLink has a huge hack and all the accounts got deleted, or everybody's store got nuked. Like, you can have a BSX backup or small things like that, but if there was actually something that shut down the platform you sell on, that's not something you should probably be planning for or putting much mental energy into at all, because it's like, what are you going to do? Like, you can plan for that, but even if it happens, your best plan is still going to be, like, at best 25% of what you're doing right now.
Right.
It's the risk reward, because obviously this depends a lot based on industry. If you're in, like, a super secure industry
making.
Like cabinet making, or like storing people, like if you run a company where your whole job is to store people's banking information for reference, like so that other companies don't have to store it, then the amount of money you're spending on those 0.01% data breach prevention strategies should probably be way more than we would recommend for something like, if your BrickLink store gets nuked, because it's the risk versus reward, right? Of you should pay insurance because it's not a ton of money, but you should not go all out in installing extremely complicated fire suppression systems and the ability to, like, evacuate all air from your BrickLink room. But if you run a bank or you're running some kind of antique storage facility, then maybe installing that kind of stuff is worth it. So it's just being aware of what is your threshold for saying, okay, this isn't worth it anymore.
And also, like, I don't know why we're stuck on the fire example. I keep going with it. Like, with the antique thing, it's like those things aren't necessarily replaceable. Whereas, like, it sucked to see my warehouse where, like, all the Lego we have burn up. But, like, if you have a good enough insurance policy, you can always buy more used Lego or whatever.
Right, and rebuild and do it over. Yeah. Yeah, there are antiques that are non-replaceable, so that would be a different.
But I guess point being, you should plan for reasonably possible risks. Like, obviously you can't know the percentage, but I'd say anything around 30, 25 if you had to eyeball it. Like, those are things where it's probably worth the time to have not a plan B or, like, and I always say, like, don't plan for failure because then you're going to hit it, but having at least a pivot point or a personal insurance policy. Like, maybe it's like you're setting aside this amount of things for when in our industry, like, the deals dry up or you can't source, but you have these few items that you've set aside that you can list in the meantime while you work on getting more supply or whatever that might be.
Yeah. I actually think, like, COVID was a great example of this. There was a lot of stuff that stores or restaurants or whatever, theoretically sure could have set, like, tens of thousands, if not hundreds, aside to, like, be buffered and stuff, but it was such an unforeseeable thing and such a tiny amount that it doesn't make sense to do that. And obviously it hurt a lot of businesses, but that's just not something you could foresee and like really plan for.
I think it's maybe, like, this is maybe off topic, but I think it's infected slightly the cultural zeitgeist where everybody's, like, expecting another COVID-19, and I don't think that's a reasonable thing to do. Even if it did actually happen, it's still so unlikely that, like, set aside money for slow sales. Don't set aside money for, like, not getting a sale 3 months in a row.
Right. Nuclear Armageddon. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, you can't. It will hurt your business now if you're trying to plan for that in the future.
Exactly.
Like, it's just going to destroy your whole business, or all your money is going to be gone. I don't know if there's anything that, like, we can think of that was maybe a big example of, like, something we've failed at or tried, and like we kind of listed.
There was the first time we tried to get into contracting is really the only thing that I can say like hurt us in the longish term. Was we had no plan, and we hired some people, provided almost no training, were upset when they weren't able to succeed.
Classic.
Let them go, had to resort it anyway, did not learn from this the first time, continued to do it over and over again for many months, and rebooted the business. Oh, I mean, we didn't reboot the whole business, but we rebooted our supply and contractor pipeline.
If people just go back to your YouTube channel at the beginning, like what you guys are doing now is so different, and I think for the better, obviously. But there's these moments where you're transitioning from how things were in the current meta to how they are now, and just at least recognizing in the not necessarily in the moment, but hopefully soon after, what went wrong and how you can learn from that. Like, I think for me, a possible failure has been moving spaces too quickly, because I underestimate the time investment of not the physical moving, but the like afterwards, like the weeks following. Like, we have to set all these things back up. We've lost a week of uploading parts. The rent is 4 times higher than it was. And all these things theoretically going into it, but there's so much that goes into resetting up and moving. And I'm glad I now have a multi-year term, so that it's not something we have to do again. Like, moving is just the worst.
I do want to jump on something that you kind of hinted at there, is like the moment that it becomes real.
Yeah.
Is just looking at something on a spreadsheet, or just actually even before that, just talking about something, the real risk and the real chance of failure might not hit you until you really truly contemplate it. And like that can be a major risk. Yeah, for me at least, I'll say a little openly, like the first time we financed as a business, the PayPal working capital, it's like, 30% of sales are going to repay the loan, and you can understand what those numbers mean, and you can know what 30% of your monthly sales looks like. But if you don't budget ahead of time for like where you're saving the 30% in the long term, there's like a big wake-up call when like 2 weeks later the balance is hinting at 0. You're like, whoa, like 30% is not a majority by any means, but it is a sizable amount of budget to all of a sudden have gone. And that was something that like really spread us thin for a while. And I've it wasn't necessarily a mistake, because the capital up front did like help with other things, but it definitely hurt other areas long term.
Yeah, we've done PayPal working capital once, and we decided, it's that's too hard for it to like take.
Were you at 30% as well?
I don't remember if it was like 25 or 30, but it was too much, and we decided like, okay, we'll do a more traditional loan where you can pay it.
Yeah, well, also
a fixed dollar amount per month, and it seems mentally easier because every week fluctuates. So if you have a month of bad sales, you'll have a hard time paying that loan monthly. But if you have a week of bad sales and you're taking 30%, well, now
it's like you've got the worst revenue you've had in a week in a year.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think. I mean, I failed so much.
I know. The thing is, there's so many little things that are just like, well, that didn't work, and then you just throw it away and you like forget about it, and you change direction and you don't turn back.
Maybe for me, I think a little anecdote that I think could relate to a lot of stores is when I started maybe this is just like an overall guiding principle. If you have any inkling that your current hobby business / side hustle could someday be bigger, if it's a small expense now or small enough time investment now that it will really help the longevity long term, probably do it. Like for me, the first 4,000 drawers we had, I hand wrote everything with a Sharpie, which doesn't work when you now have 5 people picking orders and they can't read your handwriting, and only you can, or you had the drawers memorized. So like for me, if I had to like fix some of these small things, be like label the drawers, or have a workflow for picking orders. Don't just do it whenever you feel like it, because you're the only one. Because it'll if you have any sort of feeling that it could be, you should be setting up small things, even if it's like pretty annoying in the moment, that just do the little work ahead of time.
Build structures for success.
Exactly. You hit what you aim for.
Yes. Very nice. Tying it back to last episode. Awesome. Well, I think unless there's anything you guys want to kind of close out with.
I don't think so. I think that's our.
I'll just go back to the sweeping inspirational quotes. Always assume positive intent in ambiguous situations, and you're gonna hit what you aim for. So.
Very nice. Awesome. Thank you to everyone who is either watching this on YouTube or listening on a podcast platform. As a reminder, you can always go to the opposite ones to either comment or to follow along if you're driving in the car or something.
And thank you, David, for coming out
Yes.
to sunny California.
Yeah, it's
at
been
least
great.
for a little bit here.
Yeah. Thanks for having me, and happy St. Patrick's Day, everybody.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. We'll see you all in the next episode of BrickSide Chat.
Goodbye.